Washington doesn't work. It hasn't worked in a long time. And that's been a gradual process, of course, that has now been put on steroids by the divisions of the Trump era and a president who sort of inflames them gleefully and willfully.
Have you noticed after news of trade wars, real wars, populism, climate change, a Mueller investigation, impeachment, and a fresh batch of U.S. presidential candidates, it all just starts to blend together? Well, if you're looking to make sense of 2019, this is your show. Actually, it's my show. Hello and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast, where you'll find extended versions of the interviews from my show on public television. Today on the podcast, I speak with acclaimed journalist Susan Glasser of The New Yorker to discuss the year ahead, particularly one of the world's biggest political stories, the impeachment of Donald Trump. Glasser has the chops for some much-needed context. She oversaw impeachment coverage of Bill Clinton for The Washington Post and spent 4 years in Moscow as the paper's co-bureau chief. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, understands the value of service, safety, and stability in today's uncertain world. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
Susan Glasser, New Yorker Magazine, letter from Trump's Washington. Everyone's reading it. Glad to be with you.
Lots of material, as they say.
As an insider in the Beltway, how is impeachment playing out behind the scenes?
Well, it's interesting. I do think it's a very different story in Washington than it is around the country. Understandably, the rest of the country, the rest of the world, it's not their job to take in every fact. I think there are probably low ratings for lots of previous Washington hearings, including this one.
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't think that's any surprise, really. But I do think that it's coming at a time when the ability to create any kind of national consensus over the facts is so diminished. People just throw up their hands. I can't make hide nor hair of it. Even people on both sides, by the way. I think this is both Democrats and Republicans. Again, I'm talking outside the Beltway, or people whose job it is not to focus on it. Democrats may support impeaching and removing Trump because they loathe President Trump. Republicans may support him remaining in office. I think their views of impeachment tend to be highly colored by their pre-existing views of Trump himself at this point.
On both sides.
Yeah, I worry that neither side is really taking in the full impact of this story. And that I think one of the main reasons, and I went actually last week, right before Thanksgiving, and I attended a couple of focus groups outside of Washington in central Pennsylvania among Trump voters who were now disillusioned in various degrees with him. And it was really fascinating, as you might imagine. But the big takeaway that we tend to forget here in Washington is the rest of the country's deep, deep cynicism. They actually think that perhaps President Trump didn't do anything really wrong here because they think all politicians do this, and they think they're all this corrupt. And so, of course, here inside the Beltway, even many Republicans, of course, would say, whoa, this is, we've never heard of anything like this. I thought it was a very powerful moment in the testimony when Bill Taylor, who is the senior diplomat, U.S. diplomat now on the ground in Ukraine, and he was asked.
Ambassador Taylor, in your decades of military service and diplomatic service representing the United States around the world, have you ever seen another example of foreign aid conditioned on the personal or political interests of the President of the United States?
No, Mr. Goldman, I've not.
And of course, they asked all the other witnesses as well. They all said they'd never seen anything like that.
So now that we are through the lion's share of the House, and certainly the public piece is out, so we know what the arguments are.
Right.
Has that changed views of people in the Beltway? not only about whether or not Trump, quote unquote, did it, but as to whether or not it matters. I mean, again, we now kind of know what it is. Right?
Yeah, I don't see that there's a lot of argument about whether or not Trump did it.
Right.
Even
that's what I'm saying. Not about that.
Yeah,
it's a change of views.
I think a couple things. One, it continues to be for Beltway watchers, people who are watching in particular the ongoing owning of the Republican Party on Capitol Hill by Trump. It is kind of breathtaking to watch, even one by one, even people who were perceived to be moderate or who've been more critical of Trump in the past fall in line in supporting him, number one. Number two, to watch some of the arguments that Trump has insisted that his defenders use on his behalf.
The call was perfect.
It's breathtaking.
For example.
Not only that, but he actually has them arguing with a straight face. There was a 123-page pre-buttal report issued the other day by Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee. Their argument there is that Donald Trump is a noble corruption fighter in Ukraine. This obviously does not really pass the smell test for anybody of any party.
Is your assumption that the Senate is now going to bring those sorts of arguments up, bring those sorts of witnesses up? In other words, do we expect a radically different process,
right,
topics in Senate?
Well, it's a good question. Up until now, the conventional view has been that we would see a somewhat more serious approach in the Senate, and that
because it's Senate,
and that even Republicans who ultimately would fall in line and vote to acquit the president would probably express some concerns about his behavior, and would basically adopt the argument that while this behavior was problematic or concerning or troublesome or even perhaps worthy of censure, that it was not impeachable. Which is very different than the defense advanced by the president himself and his allies in the House.
That it's a witch hunt and there's nothing.
The key dynamic to remember is that, Mitch McConnell, as the Senate Majority Leader, has long been sort of one of the underappreciated, probably most powerful person in Trump's Washington. He has been guided by one principle and one principle alone, really, over the last few years, which is the maintenance and preservation of his Republican majority in the Senate. He has Republican incumbents up for re-election in states that are very unfriendly to Trump, like Colorado, for example, or Susan Collins
in
Maine.
My understanding of the conventional wisdom, right until it's wrong, as you say, in Washington,
yes, is
that the likelihood of a Senate conviction is zero. Is that correct?
Maybe not zero, but certainly it's very, very low. You need 20 Senate Republicans to break ranks, given that, even getting one has tended to be an uphill battle. You've seen this weird situation in recent years where there's the decline of institutional power in the American political parties. At the same time, this polarization means that people are more identifying as partisans than ever before. So you see the parties hanging in line more than ever before. I mean, there were 31 House Democrats who voted at least to open the inquiry into the Clinton impeachment. Many of them didn't ultimately vote to impeach him. That kind of behavior was normal during the Reagan era. Now it's unthinkable. Washington doesn't work. It hasn't worked in a long time. And that's been a gradual process, of course, that is now been put on steroids by the divisions of the Trump era and a president who sort of inflames them gleefully and willfully.
Now, you've said that Trump reflects the greatest geopolitical threat in the world today. Now, you're someone who used to recognize very clearly that the Soviet Union was, right, the biggest geopolitical threat in the world. How do we go from an empire to a guy?
Well, that's part of it, right, is that I think the uniqueness of having an authoritarian-minded leader of the United States and, sort of titular leader of the free world, if you will, he's essentially made that a meaningless term. And so when, to me, I do look at the foreign policy landscape and I see obviously a lot of important macro long-term trends happening. But the most important of those, I would argue, was the long-term decline relative decline of both American power and American leadership in the world. So therefore, to have an American president who has such an uncertain course, an ambivalent course toward the major remaining institutions of American leadership and alliances in the world at a time when there's no obvious thing to replace them except for sort of rising adversarial powers like Russia and China, I think the destabilization of the world's remaining democratic small d leader is an unbelievably consequential story. And Americans tend to focus on the circus-like atmosphere of Trump. They tend to focus on, understandably, the domestic political consequences. You look at a country where, 35,000 people are shot dead every year, where, our school children are taught to, run under their desks and hide from active shooter situations when they're in kindergarten, and our legislature at the national level is powerless and unable to act. I mean, that's almost the definition of gridlock and a failure to do anything for the public safety. But so that, understandably, that domestic political tumult and gridlock tends to be the focus of the conversation even here in Washington.
So leaving impeachment aside, now we're looking ahead towards 2020. Mm-hmm. Your crystal ball, what do you think the biggest issues are going to be in the general election? Give me 2 or 3 of them.
Well, Trump would be issues 1 through 3, at least for a pretty big chunk of the electorate. And, you are already seeing that numbers off the charts. In some ways, actually, in both parties, by the way. You are seeing this motivation to vote, for example, is extraordinarily high, and I think is due to the polarizing personality and politics of this particular president. So, most elections in which an incumbent is on the ballot do tend to be referenda on those incumbents. Exactly. If it is a referendum on Trump, it's likely to be good for the Democrats next November. But, they're the Democrats, so, never underestimate their capacity to screw it up. Right?
So in that regard, all of the Democrats out there that are saying we need to be focused on issues, your view is actually not that. Yours is make it a strong referendum on Trump, get people to turn out.
Well, I mean, again, they are responding to polling, that people's views are fixed on Trump. And so, they're also trying right now to gain advantage in a very crowded Democratic primary, where it's assumed that the primary voters are against Trump. So the campaigns they're running in the primary are not necessarily the campaign that they would run in the general election.
That'll change.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I do think you asked about the conventional wisdom in Washington. Yep. The conventional wisdom right now is very much among, I would say, Democrats, Republicans, journalists, that Trump shouldn't win, but somehow will. And that he's winning. That is a feeling of discomfort with how the Democratic primaries played out so far. Perhaps it's a sense of unease with the nature of the Democratic field that has already brought in late entrants like Michael Bloomberg and Deval Patrick, neither of whom seem to be emerging, by the way, as any kind of savior of the Democrats. So, I say that just as a sort of baseline setting. We can say that here in December of 2019, again, the Washington conventional wisdom is almost always wrong. So I'm fascinated to see what way it will turn out to be wrong. But right now, that's the view.
Now, when we look ahead at 2020, what actually concerns you the most?
Well, you'll hear a lot of people say, that a 2-term Trump presidency is way, way more consequential and way, way harder to recover from than a 1-term Trump presidency. And, because we have very little sense of what his actual agenda is, either legislatively or just in a bigger picture policy sense, he clearly wants to do bigger and more disruptive things, even in his first term, than he's been able to do. Remember that there's been just epic levels of sort of dysfunction, incompetence, turnover on the staff has been so high. It's very hard to get anything done when people are cycling in and out, when the sort of core cadres, professional cadres of even your own Republican Party have basically refused to serve under you, or those who have tried have been thrown out or run through the meat grinder. that makes it very, very hard to enact any program, especially one as disruptive as Trump's is potentially. And so the question would be in a second term, both what is the agenda and will he have better prospects for following through on some of those really transformative things?
If you have the ability to be reassured by something that matters, consequential, going into 2020, U.S. politics, it's what?
Look, I'm really looking to see what role, if any, the courts play and the Supreme Court plays on some of these core issues of executive power over the next few months. One aspect of the Trump era, which is not surprising if you look at Trump's history as a private businessman and his very litigious nature, but we're looking at a record number of really significant constitutional challenges that are making their way through our court system that delineate what kind of power and authority Donald Trump and future presidents as a result would have, everything from being required to turn over his tax returns to Congress, which is one of the cases making its way through, his ability to continue to make money from foreign officials and governments while in office, his ability to defy subpoenas of Congress for himself and his administration in the course of the impeachment proceedings. I think that we will really understand a lot more what kind of democracy we're left with when we see what, if anything, the Supreme Court, with its now 5-4 Republican majority, has to say about that. Chief Justice John Roberts takes great umbrage at the notion that there's such a thing as Republican justices and Democratic justices. He will also be called upon to preside personally over this Senate impeachment trial. But will he really be able to command a majority to rein Trump in? Will there be any decision like the landmark Nixon versus United States decision that was, one of the culminating events of Watergate?
But you feel good about that?
We'll see.
That's what reassures you. So if you're being reassured by it.
I would be reassured.
Yes.
If both the Congress and the judiciary took steps, especially in this very difficult environment, to assert the prerogatives of a democracy that's of laws and not of men. I think that would be a pretty big deal.
Okay, to close this out, we've got to do a lightning round.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you some random questions about Washington. You're going to give me answers real fast.
All right,
okay, whatever
all right.
comes to mind.
This is word association.
Well, it's sort of like that. Yeah, so first of all, Susan Glasser, first of all, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, does he run for Senate?
I think he wants to, yes.
You think he does? Who is, among the 30,000 people that have run for the Democratic nomination, which is the one that hasn't run that you really would have liked to have seen in the race?
I'm a fan of Mitch Landrieu.
From Louisiana.
From Louisiana.
Former mayor of New Orleans.
I am.
Have you gone to the International Trump Hotel to get scoops or overhear people in the administration?
I have been there only a couple times. I did encounter very interesting things when I went there, but it's basically a very large, often empty, gigantic room with many, many screens of television all tuned into Fox.
Okay, if you had to leave Washington, D.C. and had to cover the politics of one state in our nation for the coming electoral cycle, it would be what?
Texas.
Because?
I don't know. Is it gonna turn blue again? I don't think so. Maybe not this cycle, but it's a pretty interesting state.
Okay, and who's going to get the nomination on the Democratic side?
I don't know.
Your gut. What's your gut
Who
tell
do
you?
think?
What's your gut tell you? I'm interviewing you. You get to ask me next time.
Joe Biden has not performed well, but he might just pull it out.
He might just pull it out, and his running mate would be?
He's saying a lot of nice things about the recently departed Kamala Harris, isn't he?
He has indeed. Susan Glasser, wonderful to be with you.
Thank you.
That's it for the podcast this week. We'll be back in your feed next week. Check out full episodes of GZERO World on public television or at gzeromedia.com.
The GZERO World podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, understands the value of service, safety, and stability in today's uncertain world. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast. your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.